The source that I have is impeccable, and he said that not only were the cameras smashed, plural cameras smashed, so that the suspect likely knew about the locations of them, but that the car belonging to the sister of Savannah Guthrie, Annie Guthrie, was towed, impounded, and taken into evidence. And that, and this is the wording, it's very important. The wording is very important. He said they now believe the son-in-law may be the prime suspect. Those are the words. Son-in-law may be the prime suspect at this point.
The room was already silent until the question was asked. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look down. Instead, he leaned toward the microphone and said, "She wasn't alone." Everything changed in that moment. Reporters stopped writing. Cameras kept rolling, but no one moved. Because up until then, this had been a story about one woman, one quiet home, one unexplained disappearance. Now, there was something else. Another presence, another set of hands, another version of that night that no one had heard before. And somewhere far from that room, out past the streetlights, past the neighborhoods, into the open desert, investigators had already uncovered something they weren't supposed to find. Not a body, not a confession. Something colder. Something that shouldn't have been there at all. And the most unsettling part, that discovery didn't answer the question. It made it impossible to ignore. This is Crimson Archive, and this case didn't begin with a disappearance. It began with a moment no one can fully explain. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old when she disappeared from her home in Tucson, Arizona. She lived alone in a quiet residential neighborhood, the kind of place where daily routines were predictable and rarely interrupted. There was nothing about her lifestyle that suggested she was at risk. Family members described her as independent, alert, and consistent in her habits. On February 1, 2026, something changed. Nancy was reported missing from her home, and almost immediately, investigators began treating the case as more than a standard missing person report. Early observations at the scene raised concerns that her disappearance may not have been voluntary. Inside the home, there were signs that something had gone wrong. Authorities noted evidence that suggested a disturbance, and investigators later confirmed the presence of blood within the residence. This was not consistent with someone simply leaving on their own. At the same time, surveillance footage from the area added another layer of concern. A masked individual had been seen near the property around the time Nancy was last believed to be inside. That detail quickly shifted the focus of the case toward a possible abduction. As local authorities began processing the scene, additional agencies, including federal investigators, became involved. The scale of the response reflected the seriousness of what they were dealing with. From the very beginning, this case carried indicators that pointed in one direction. This wasn't a random disappearance. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old at the time of her disappearance, and according to publicly available information, she was living independently in her home in Tucson, Arizona. Details about her personal routine have not been extensively released by investigators, but there were no confirmed indications that she planned to leave her home on February 1st. Authorities have not reported any travel arrangements, packed belongings, or communications suggesting she intended to go anywhere. That absence is one of the earliest indicators that her disappearance may not have been voluntary. In cases involving older adults, even small disruptions in routine can raise concern. When there is no explanation for that disruption, investigators begin to look more closely at the surrounding circumstances. In Nancy's case, that escalation quickly, due to what was observed at the scene and the lack of any contact after she was last believed to be inside her home. Her family responded early and remained actively involved as the investigation developed. They spoke publicly in measured terms, focusing on the urgency for accurate information and a thorough investigation. Their approach reflected both urgency and caution,
avoiding assumptions while emphasizing that Nancy's disappearance was out of character. Authorities have also been careful in what they have released regarding her personal background. There has been no detailed public disclosure of specific medical conditions or daily habits that would directly explain her sudden absence. That lack of detail leaves investigators relying heavily on physical evidence and verified timelines rather than personal history alone. What remains clear is that Nancy Guthrie's disappearance did not follow a pattern consistent with someone choosing to leave. There were no confirmed signs of preparation, no communication indicating intent, and no immediate explanation for her absence. Her routine, whatever its exact structure, did not include disappearing without warning. On the evening of February 1st, Nancy Guthrie was believed to be inside her home in Tucson, Arizona. Investigators have identified that time frame as the last point at which she was known to be in a place considered safe. What happened after that remains the central question of the case. Authorities have not released a precise minute-by-minute account of Nancy's movements that night, but they have confirmed that the situation escalated quickly. By the time her disappearance was reported, there were already indicators that this was not a routine missing person case. One of the earliest concerns came from what investigators found inside the home. Evidence at the scene suggested that something had gone wrong. Officials later confirmed the presence of blood within the residence. This was not consistent with someone simply leaving on their own. At the same time, surveillance footage from the surrounding area added another layer to the timeline. A masked individual was seen near the property around the time Nancy was last believed to be inside. That detail quickly shifted the focus of the case toward a possible abduction. As local authorities began processing the scene, additional agencies, including federal investigators, became involved. The scale of the response reflected the seriousness of what they were dealing with. From the very beginning, this case carried indicators that pointed in one direction. This wasn't a random disappearance. As investigations continued building the case, one of the most important areas of focus became the digital evidence connected to Nancy Guthrie's home. Unlike physical evidence, which is limited to what can be seen and collected, digital systems can capture timing, movement, and interaction with a level of precision that helps investigators narrow down critical moments. In this case, one of the earliest confirmed indicators came from the home's doorbell camera system. Surveillance footage showed a masked individual approaching the property during the early hours of the morning. The person appeared deliberate in their actions, moving directly toward the camera rather than avoiding it. Within a short period, that same camera system was tampered with and ultimately disabled. The interruption was not random. It occurred during a narrow window that investigators now consider central to the timeline of Nancy's disappearance. That detail alone significantly changed the direction of the case. Because disabling a camera requires awareness, it suggests that whoever approached the home understood that the system was there, knew its purpose, and acted to prevent it from continuing to record. This was not incidental contact or accidental damage. It was targeted interference. At around the same time, additional activity was recorded by nearby systems. While authorities have not released every technical detail, they have confirmed that there was movement detected in proximity to the home during that same window. This aligns with the presence of the masked individual and reinforces the idea that the events of that night were coordinated. Another critical piece of information involves Nancy's pacemaker monitoring system. Reports have confirmed that a scheduled transmission from her device did not occur as expected. Under normal circumstances, these systems transmit data at regular intervals. When that pattern is disrupted, it becomes a point of concern. Investigators have not released exact data from the device, but the missed transmission provides a reference point in the timeline. It suggests that something may have occurred around the same period when the other anomalies were recorded. While it does not explain what happened, it helps define when events may have taken place. Taken together, these digital indicators begin to form a pattern. A masked individual approaches the home, surveillance is interfered with, movement is detected in the area, A medical monitoring system fails to report as expected. Each of these events on its own might raise questions, but occurring within the same general time frame, they point toward a sequence that is difficult to ignore. Investigators rely on patterns like this to establish intent, because when multiple indicators point to the same period, it becomes less likely that those disruptions are coincidental. It suggests planning, it suggests awareness of the environment, and it suggests that whoever was involved understood how to operate within that space without immediately drawing attention. This required knowledge, not chance. As investigations continued building the case, one of the primary areas of focus became establishing a reliable timeline. In any disappearance, understanding when events occurred is critical, but in this case, much of that timeline has not been fully disclosed, leaving only key reference points confirmed through evidence. Authorities have identified a specific window during the night of February 1st when the situation escalated. This window is defined by a series of confirmed irregularities rather than exact timestamps. Among those are the appearance of a masked individual near the home and the disruption of the doorbell camera system. These events are closely linked in time and are considered central to the investigation. Another reference point comes from Nancy's pacemaker monitoring system. A scheduled transmission from her device did not occur as expected.
While officials have not released the precise timing of that missed signal, it has been acknowledged as part of the broader effort to understand when something may have gone wrong. What makes this reconstruction more complex is the absence of certain expected actions. There has been no confirmed report of a call to emergency services from the home during that critical period. In situations involving sudden distress or an unexpected incident, a 911 call is often one of the first responses. The lack of such a call, combined with the physical evidence found inside the residence, raises additional questions about what was happening during that time. Investigators have also been examining activity in and around the property. This includes reviewing surveillance footage and analyzing movement patterns in the surrounding area. While specific details about vehicles or individuals beyond the masked figure have not been fully released, authorities continue to focus on identifying any movement that could help define the sequence of events. Each confirmed detail adds structure to the timeline, even if the full picture remains incomplete. A person appears near the home. Surveillance is interfered with. A monitoring system fails to transmit. No emergency call is placed, and within that sequence, Nancy Guthrie disappears. From an investigative perspective, timelines are not built on assumptions, but on confirmed points that can be connected. Even without exact times, the alignment of these events within a single window is significant. Because when multiple indicators point to the same period, it begins to narrow the possibilities. Does this look like panic or something else? As the investigation developed, one of the key questions investigators focused on was access. When a crime appears to originate from within a home without clear signs of forced entry, it shifts the direction of the case. It suggests that whoever was involved may have found a way inside without immediately drawing attention. That possibility becomes a central line of inquiry, especially in the early stages. In Nancy Guthrie's case, authorities have not publicly identified a suspect or named a person of interest. No individual has been officially connected to the events inside the home, and investigators have been careful not to release details that could compromise the case. But even without a named suspect, certain investigative patterns begin to emerge. Law enforcement typically examines who had legitimate or potential access to a residence. This includes individuals who may have been familiar with the property, aware of its layout, or capable of approaching without drawing alarm. At the same time, they also consider the possibility of an unknown intruder, someone who observed the home, understood its vulnerabilities, and acted within a specific window of opportunity. That distinction remains important.
because the presence of a masked individual near the property, combined with the targeted interference of the doorbell camera system, indicates a level of awareness. The person seen on surveillance did not move randomly. Their actions appeared deliberate, focused, and timed. That alone suggests preparation. While authorities continue to gather and analyze evidence, public attention has remained fixed on the unanswered question of who was responsible. With no official suspect named, speculation has been limited by the lack of confirmed information. Investigators have instead focused on building a case through evidence rather than assumptions. At the same time, Nancy's family has remained active in seeking answers. They have continued to speak publicly, urging anyone with information to come forward and emphasizing the importance of keeping the case visible. Their approach has been steady and consistent, centered on finding out what happened rather than assigning blame. This creates a contrast that often appears in cases like this. On one side, an active investigation working through evidence methodically without revealing its full direction. On the other, a family searching for clarity in the absence of immediate answers. Between those two, there is a gap, and within that gap, the identity of the person responsible remains unknown. As the investigation intensified, authorities stepped forward to address the growing public attention. By this point, the case had already shifted beyond a missing person report. Investigators made it clear that the evidence inside Nancy Guthrie's home pointed toward a criminal act and that her disappearance was being treated with urgency at the highest level. During official updates, law enforcement confirmed what they could without compromising the case. They acknowledged the presence of a masked individual near the home, the interference with the doorbell camera system, and the physical evidence recovered from inside the residence. Each of these details reinforced the same conclusion: something had gone wrong within a very specific window of time. But what stood out was not just what was confirmed, it was what investigators were beginning to consider. Without naming suspects or outlining a definitive theory, authorities indicated that they were exploring multiple possibilities based on the evidence. That included examining whether the actions observed that night could have involved more than one individual. This was not presented as a conclusion, it was a shift in direction. Because when sequence of events involves controlled access, targeted disruption of surveillance, and precise timing, investigators are forced to ask a broader question. Not just who was there, but whether one person could have carried out everything that occurred within that time frame. That question changes the scope of the case. It moves the investigation from tracking a single unidentified figure to analyzing whether coordination may have played a role. No further details were released, no explanation of what led investigators to that line of thinking, but the implication was clear. This was no longer a straightforward reconstruction of a single set of actions. It was becoming something more complex. And as that possibility entered the investigation, it introduced a new layer of uncertainty, one that would shape every step that followed. Because if more than one person was involved, then the events of that night were not just deliberate, they were organized. As the investigation progressed, the focus began to extend beyond the immediate scene of Nancy Guthrie's home. What started as a contained inquiry gradually widened as investigators worked to determine whether the events of that night remained within the residence or continued elsewhere. Authorities have not publicly confirmed the recovery of evidence outside the home. However, they have indicated that the scope of the investigation is not limited to a single location. When a case involves indications of forced action within a residence and the sudden disappearance of an individual, investigators routinely examine the possibility that movement occurred after the initial incident. That shift in focus is critical, because once the possibility of movement is introduced, the investigation expands geographically. It is no longer just about what happened inside the home, but about where events may have continued and how someone could have left the area without immediate detection. Law enforcement agencies use a range of methods to identify areas of interest beyond an initial scene. While specific techniques have not been disclosed in this case, such efforts often include reviewing surveillance coverage in surrounding areas, analyzing traffic patterns, and following up on tips that point to locations outside the immediate neighborhood. In Nancy's case, investigators have confirmed that they are actively pursuing leads and examining information that could extend the timeline beyond the residence. This includes evaluating how someone could have entered, acted within the home, and then left the area without immediate attention. At the same time, the environment surrounding Tucson adds additional complexity. Beyond the city limits, the terrain becomes more isolated, with large stretches of open land that are difficult to monitor in real time. Areas like these are often considered in investigations, not because evidence has been confirmed there, but because they represent locations where activity could occur without immediate visibility. Search efforts in such cases are often not publicly detailed. Authorities often withhold information about where they are looking or what they are following up on, especially when those details could influence the behavior of individuals connected to the case. What becomes clear during this phase is not the confirmation of a second scene, but the growing possibility of one. Because when evidence suggests that an incident occurred inside a home, yet the individual is no longer there, investigators are forced to consider how the situation evolved. That includes the possibility that what happened did not end at the point where it began. And once that possibility enters the investigation, every lead, every location, and every movement becomes part of a much larger search. Because if events extended beyond that house, then whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie did not stay in one place. As investigators continued to try to refine the timeline, they turned their attention to every available source of digital information inside the home. In modern investigations, even small fragments of data can help establish when events occurred, especially in cases where direct witnesses are absent. Authorities have confirmed that multiple forms of digital evidence are being reviewed as part of the case.
This includes surveillance systems, previously identified disruptions, and any other electronic data that could provide insight into activity docked at the residence. However, beyond the doorbell camera footage and its interruption, officials have not publicly confirmed the involvement of additional smart devices or audio recordings. That absence is important, because while technology has the potential to capture precise moments, it does not always provide a complete picture. Not every system records continuously, and not every interaction is stored or accessible. In this case, investigators are working with a timeline that is supported by certain confirmed points, but still contains gaps. Those gaps define this stage of the investigation. The presence of a masked individual near the home, the interference with the camera system, and the missed pacemaker transmission all serve as anchor points. They indicate that something occurred within a specific window. But between those points, there are still unanswered questions about the exact sequence of events. Investigators are continuing to examine whether any additional digital signals, such as system activity, device usage, or environmental triggers, can help narrow that window further. At this time, no such details have been publicly released. That does not mean they do not exist, but it does mean they have not been confirmed as part of the official narrative. What remains clear is that the timeline is being built carefully, using only what can be verified. In cases like this, even the absence of data becomes part of the analysis. A system that does not activate, a device that records nothing, or a lack of expected interaction can be just as telling as a confirmed event. These silent gaps help investigators understand not just what happened, but what did not happen. And in a case defined by narrow windows and missing moments, those gaps are not just empty space. They are part of the story investigators are still trying to complete. As the investigation moved deeper, the focus shifted toward interviews in the careful comparison of statements against the evidence already collected.
This phase is where cases begin to take shape, not through assumptions, but through consistency. Investigators began conducting formal and informal interviews with individuals connected to Nancy Guthrie's life and timeline. These conversations are a standard part of any major investigation. They are designed to establish context, verify movements, and identify anything that does not align with known facts. At this stage, the process becomes precise. Questions are no longer general, they are tied to specific elements: access to the home, familiarity with the property, and movements on the night of February 1st. Each response is evaluated against what investigators already know from the scene, the digital evidence, and the limited but critical timeline that has been established. One key area of focus is consistency. When multiple accounts describe the same time frame, investigators look for alignment. If details match, they help reinforce the timeline. But when differences, small contradictions, or unclear explanations, those become points of interest, not conclusions, but areas that require further clarification. Authorities have not publicly released the content of these interviews. No names have officially been tied to conflicting statements, and no detailed transcripts have been made available. But what has been made clear is that the process of comparing statements to evidence is ongoing. This includes examining how descriptions of events align with known facts, such as the disruption of the camera system, the presence of an unidentified individual near the home, and the absence of any confirmed emergency call. Each of these elements acts as a reference point. If a statement fits within those boundaries, it supports the timeline. If it does not, it raises questions. Investigators also look at how timelines are described. In cases like this, gaps are just as important as confirmed moments. Periods that cannot be clearly accounted for are revisited, often multiple times, to determine whether additional information can fill them. This process is methodical. It does not rely on a single interview or a single answer. It builds over time as more information is gathered and compared. What emerges is not a dramatic confrontation, but a gradual narrowing. Because as evidence and statements are placed side by side, the margin for inconsistency becomes smaller. And when that margin closes, what remains is a clearer picture of what could have happened and what could not have happened. In this phase, the investigation is no longer just about collecting information. It is about testing it. As the investigation moved deeper, the focus shifted toward interviews and the careful comparison of statements against the evidence already collected. This phase is where cases begin to take shape, not through assumptions, but through consistency. Investigators began conducting formal and informal interviews with individuals connected to Nancy Guthrie's life and timeline. These conversations are a standard part of any major investigation. They are designed to establish context, verify movements, and identify anything that does not align with known facts. At this stage, the process becomes precise. Questions are no longer general, they are tied to specific elements: access to the home, familiarity with the property, and movements on the night of February 1st. Each response is evaluated against what investigators already know from the scene, the digital evidence, and the limited but critical timeline that has been established. One key area of focus is consistency. When multiple accounts describe the same time frame, investigators look for alignment. If details match, they help reinforce the timeline. But when differences, small contradictions, or unclear explanations, those become points of interest, not conclusions, but areas that require further clarification. Authorities have not publicly released the content of these interviews. No names have officially been tied to conflicting statements, and no detailed transcripts have been made available. But what has been made clear is that the process of comparing statements to evidence is ongoing. This includes examining how descriptions of events align with known facts, such as the disruption of the camera system, the presence of an unidentified individual near the home, and the absence of any confirmed emergency call. Each of these elements acts as a reference point. If a statement fits within those boundaries, it supports the timeline. If it does not, it raises questions. Investigators also look at how timelines are described. In cases like this, gaps are just as important as confirmed moments. Periods that cannot be clearly accounted for are revisited, often multiple times, to determine whether additional information can fill them. This process is methodical. It does not rely on a single interview or a single answer. It builds over time as more information is gathered and compared. What emerges is not a dramatic confrontation, but a gradual narrowing. Because as evidence and statements are placed side by side, the margin for inconsistency becomes smaller. And when that margin closes, what remains is a clearer picture of what could have happened and what could not have happened. In this phase, the investigation is no longer just about collecting information. It is about testing it. As the investigation moved deeper, the focus shifted toward interviews and the careful comparison of statements against the evidence already collected. This phase is where cases begin to take shape, not through assumptions, but through consistency. Investigators began conducting formal and informal interviews with individuals connected to Nancy Guthrie's life and timeline. These conversations are a standard part of any major investigation. They are designed to establish context, verify movements, and identify anything that does not align with known facts. At this stage, the process becomes precise. Questions are no longer general, they are tied to specific elements: access to the home, familiarity with the property, and movements on the night of February 1st. Each response is evaluated against what investigators already know from the scene, the digital evidence, and the limited but critical timeline that has been established. One key area of focus is consistency. When multiple accounts describe the same time frame, investigators look for alignment. If details match, they help reinforce the timeline. But when differences, small contradictions, or unclear explanations, those become points of interest, not conclusions, but areas that require further clarification. Authorities have not publicly released the content of these interviews. No names have officially been tied to conflicting statements, and no detailed transcripts have been made available. But what has been made clear is that the process of comparing statements to evidence is ongoing. This includes examining how descriptions of events align with known facts, such as the disruption of the camera system, the presence of an unidentified individual near the home, and the absence of any confirmed emergency call. Each of these elements acts as a reference point. If a statement fits within those boundaries, it supports the timeline.
If it does not, it raises questions. Investigators also look at how timelines are described. In cases like this, gaps are just as important as confirmed moments. Periods that cannot be clearly accounted for are revisited, often multiple times, to determine whether additional information can fill them. This process is methodical. It does not rely on a single interview or a single answer. It builds over time as more information is gathered and compared. What emerges is not a dramatic confrontation, but a gradual narrowing. Because as evidence and statements are placed side by side, the margin for inconsistency becomes smaller. And when that margin closes, what remains is a clearer picture of what could have happened and what could not have happened. In this phase, the investigation is no longer just about collecting information. It is about testing it. As the investigation continued to develop, one question began to take on greater significance: whether the events of that night could be explained by a single individual or if they pointed towards something more complex. This shift did not come from speculation, but from the nature of the evidence itself.
Investigators had already established several key elements. A masked individual was seen near the home, the doorbell camera system was deliberately disrupted, and Nancy Guthrie disappeared within a narrow and critical window of time. Each of these points, on its own, was significant, but when considered together, they began to raise a deeper question about how those actions were carried out. Because timing matters. The sequence of events suggests a level of coordination, entry, movement inside the home, interference with surveillance, and exit, all occurring within a limited time frame. Investigators must consider whether a single person could realistically execute each of those steps without error, or whether the situation may have involved more than one individual operating with a shared objective. Authorities have not confirmed the involvement of multiple people. No additional suspects have been publicly identified, and no official statement has declared that more than one person was present. But in cases where actions appear controlled and deliberate, investigators are required to evaluate every possibility supported by the evidence. That includes the possibility of coordination. Coordination does not necessarily mean visibility. It does not require multiple individuals to appear on camera or leave obvious traces. In some cases, it is inferred through timing. How quickly actions occur, how smoothly transitions happen, and how different elements of an event align within a confined window. In this case, those elements remain under review. Investigators continue to analyze whether the sequence of events reflects a single continuous action or multiple actions working in parallel. That distinction is critical. It affects how timelines are constructed, how movements are interpreted, and ultimately, how responsibility is assigned. At this stage, the answer has not been made public, but the question remains central to the investigation. Because if the events of that night required more than one person, then what happened inside that home was not just deliberate, it was coordinated. And that leads to a question investigators have yet to answer. Who else was there? As the investigation continued to develop, attention turned toward one of the most difficult questions in any case: motive. Understanding why something may have happened is often as important as determining how it happened. But in Nancy Guthrie's case, authorities have not publicly confirmed any clear motive behind her disappearance. No specific conflict, dispute, or triggering event has been officially identified. Even so, investigators do not leave that question unanswered. As part of standard procedure, they examine the broader context of a person's life. This includes reviewing financial records, personal relationships, and any recent changes in routine or circumstances. These areas are not explored based on assumption, but to identify patterns that may provide insight into possible pressures or influences. Financial activity is one of those areas. Investigators typically review account history, looking for unusual transactions, sudden changes, or patterns that fall outside normal behavior. These details can sometimes point to underlying issues, but they can also confirm stability. At this stage, no public information has indicated that financial factors played a role in Nancy's case. Personal and legal circumstances are also considered, but again, no confirmed details have been released linking them to her disappearance. Authorities have not indicated that any recent decisions or documented changes are central to the investigation. What remains significant, however, is timing. In cases where events unfold within a narrow window, investigators look closely at what was happening in the days leading up to that moment, not to draw immediate conclusions, but to understand whether anything aligns with the timeline already being constructed. So far, that alignment has not been made public. What this phase of the investigation reveals is not a confirmed motive, but the absence of one. And in many cases, that absence becomes part of the challenge, because without a clear reason, the focus remains on the evidence. And until that evidence points to a definitive explanation, the question of why remains open. shaping the direction of everything that follows. As the investigation continued to progress, attention began to shift toward the legal stage that often follows the collection of evidence. In cases involving suspected criminal activity, this phase is where investigators and legal authorities begin to evaluate whether the available information meets the standard required for formal action. At this point, however, no public announcements have been made regarding charges or court proceedings in Nancy Guthrie's case. Authorities have not confirmed that the case has moved into a prosecutorial phase, and no individuals have been officially named in connection with her disappearance. That silence is not unusual. Legal developments in cases like this often occur outside of public view. Before any formal steps are taken, evidence must be carefully reviewed, verified, and organized. Investigators work to ensure that timelines are consistent, that physical and digital findings align, and that any conclusions drawn can be supported under legal scrutiny. This process can take time. It involves coordination between investigators and legal professionals, with a focus on building a case that is both accurate and defensible. Every detail is re-examined, and any uncertainty must be addressed before moving forward. Unlike the earlier stages of the investigation, where information is gathered and explored, this stage is about confirmation. For the public, it can appear as though progress has slowed, but in reality, this stage represents a different kind of movement, one that is quieter, more deliberate, and focused on what comes next. Authorities are no longer asking what happened. They are evaluating whether what they know can meet the standard required for formal legal action. As of now, no such action has been announced, but the case has reached a point where the groundwork for that possibility is being carefully considered behind the scenes. As the case stands, key elements of Nancy Guthrie's case begin to form a clearer structure, even if the full picture remains incomplete. Investigators have established key points that anchor the timeline. A masked individual appears near the home. The doorbell camera system is deliberately disrupted. Evidence inside the residence confirms that something significant occurred within a defined window of time. These elements do not exist in isolation. They align, forming a sequence that investigators continue to examine with precision. That sequence matters, because when separate pieces of evidence begin to support one another, they reduce uncertainty, they narrow possibilities, they allow investigators to move from broad questions toward more focused conclusions about what could have happened and how. And yet, even with that alignment, the case is not complete. Critical gaps remain. Nancy Guthrie has not been located. The identity of the individual seen on surveillance has not been publicly confirmed. The exact sequence of events inside that key window is still being reconstructed, step by step, using only what can be verified. This is where the case stands, not at the beginning where everything is unknown, and not at the end where every question has been answered, but in the middle where evidence has begun to take shape but the final conclusions have not yet been reached. For investigators, this stage is about persistence, continuing to test the timeline, continuing to follow leads, continuing to examine every detail until the remaining gaps are closed. Because in cases like this, answers don't always come quickly. But when the evidence begins to align, it brings the investigation closer to one outcome: the truth behind what happened inside that home and what followed after Nancy Guthrie disappeared. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. At Crimson Archive, every case is broken down with a focus on evidence, timelines, and what can actually be verified, not speculation. And as cases like this continue to develop,
New details matter. So if you want clear, fact-driven updates and deeper investigations into cases that are still unfolding, subscribe and stay with us. And before you go, share your thoughts below. What do you think happened in this case?